All right, let's jump right in. You've got these ancient stories from the Bible, passed down for thousands of years. And then you've got archaeology, literally digging into the past. So what happens when you put them together? It's one of history's great puzzles, right? Can the shovel prove the story? And that's really the million-dollar question we're tackling in this explainer. Can we dig something up that gives us a definite 100% yes or no on events from that long ago? Well, as you're about to see, the answer is way more complicated, and honestly, a lot more fascinating than you might think.
You know, I think we all secretly hope that archaeology is like a time machine. We want to find a stone that says King David was here for sure. But the reality? It's way more like being a detective showing up to a cold case. The evidence is in pieces, the clues are kind of cryptic, and what it all means is always up for careful and often heated debate.
Yeah, every archaeologist is up against a couple of huge challenges. First off, the evidence is almost never complete. We're working with tiny fragments of a gigantic lost world. And second, and this is the big one, our interpretation of what we find is always a little bit shaky. It's tentative. What a discovery means can change. It's a human process, which means it's always being revised. So, to really see how this all works, let's open up our first case file, the hunt for the legendary mines of King Solomon. This story is the perfect example of how an archaeological fact can completely flip on its head over time. So, picture this. It's the 1930s, and an archaeologist named Nelson Gluck makes what looks like an incredible discovery down by the Red Sea. He finds what he thinks is a massive, ancient copper smelting plant, and he doesn't hold back. He calls it the Pittsburgh of Old Palestine, a phenomenal industrial site tied directly to King Solomon.
So here was Gluck's big idea. He found this building, and its walls had these 2 rows of holes. He argued that these were brilliantly designed flues, positioned just right to catch the powerful winds whipping through the valley. They'd funnel that air right into a furnace, creating what he thought was the world's first ever blast furnace. It was an amazing theory, and it seemed to perfectly explain King Solomon's legendary wealth.
But then the whole story takes a massive U-turn. More than 20 years later, as more sites were being excavated across the region, a different picture started to emerge. And this is the amazing part. It was Gluck himself who reevaluated the evidence. He realized that this kind of construction, with holes left behind by rotted-out wooden beams, was actually super common. The blast furnace was probably just a granary or a storehouse.
And this just shows you how the debate never really ends. First, Gluck announces his amazing discovery. Then, he himself retracts it. Then, another archaeologist, Bino Rothenberg, comes along and says the mining in the area is from centuries before Solomon even existed. But wait, it's not over. In the 80s, John Bimson reanalyzes the data and argues that actually the radiocarbon dates do point back to Solomon's time. The debate is still going.
So what's the big lesson from all this? Well, it's that archaeological interpretation is not a final verdict written in stone. It's a living, breathing conversation between experts, and it's always changing as new evidence comes to light.
Okay, let's move on to our second case, which honestly raises the stakes even higher. We're talking about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Were they real people who actually walked the earth, or are they more like foundational myths? This has been one of the fiercest debates in the field. For a long, long time, you basically had 2 camps. On one side, you had major skeptics like Wellhausen, who famously called the stories a glorified mirage, basically saying they were just fictions written much, much later. But then on the other side, you had scholars like John Bright, who argued with just as much confidence that yes, we can believe these were real people and their stories are firmly based in history. Just when it seemed like the more confident view was gaining ground, the whole debate got turned on its head again. In the 1970s, a new generation of scholars came along and really challenged that consensus. They argued that any evidence linking the patriarchs to a specific time period was, at best, circumstantial. Suddenly, the pendulum started to swing back towards skepticism. So what kind of evidence could possibly move the needle in a debate like this? You might think the answers would be found digging around in Israel, right? Well, the biggest clues have actually come from somewhere else entirely, from huge archives of ancient texts discovered all across the Near East. I mean, we're talking about thousands upon thousands of ancient clay tablets. We've got troves from Mari in Mesopotamia, from Nuzi, from Ebla in Syria. These aren't stories. They're things like letters, legal documents, marriage contracts. They give us this unbelievable,
unfiltered look into the world at the very time the patriarchs were said to have lived.
But here's the catch, and it's a really important one. In all those thousands of tablets, not a single one mentions Abraham. Not one mentions Isaac or Jacob. So you have to ask, if they don't provide that smoking gun proof, what good are they?
Well, their value comes down to this one kind of fancy word, verisimilitude. All it means is the appearance of being true or real. It means something has the ring of truth to it. So these ancient texts don't prove the specific events in Genesis happened, but what they do is show that the world described in Genesis, its customs, its laws, even its names, fits like a glove with the historical period it's supposed to be from.
Let's get specific. How does this verisimilitude actually work? Well, let's start with something simple but really powerful. Personal names. Just take a look at this. The name Abram, well, names like it pop up in Babylonian texts. Jacob, that exact name is found in Mesopotamian texts from the 18th century BC, and the list goes on. Terah, Nahor, Ishmael, Dan, all these classic Genesis names are right at home in other texts from that specific time and place. Now you might be thinking, so what? Names get reused, but here's why it's such a big deal. As the scholar John Bright explains, these are not the kind of names that were common in later Israelite history. Centuries later, people weren't naming their kids Abram or Nahor. The fact that Genesis is filled with these older, specific types of names strongly suggests the stories come from a genuinely ancient tradition, not something invented 1,000 years later.
So let's just lay out the thinking here, step by step. It's actually pretty straightforward. 1. We see all these specific names and customs in the book of Genesis. 2. We dig up all these other ancient texts and find those same types of names and customs were common in the 2nd millennium BC. So the conclusion. The world of Genesis authentically reflects the culture of that early period. And that really brings us to the big takeaway here. Archaeology rarely gives us a simple thumbs up or thumbs down on a specific person or event from the deep past. Its real superpower is in reconstructing a world. It gives us that vital cultural background. It adds that all-important verisimilitude. And it helps us understand the context these ancient stories were born into.
Which kind of leaves us with one last thing to chew on. When we're sifting through the sands of history, is the goal really to find a final verdict, like a judge in a courtroom? Or is it more about opening a window so we can get a better glimpse, a better understanding of a world that is so incredibly different from our own?